Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the YouTube channel grecochess, where we present the various aspects of the game of chess. I'm your host. My name is Harry Lausaniziris, and in this video, we continue and conclude my participation of the most recent chessanity chess tournament that took place at Jericho, Long Island. If you've seen the previous videos, I started with 2 wins, so I had a good chance to at least tie for first place. There are 3 players with 2 wins, 2 would play with each other, and I would have to play with someone that had 1 win and 1 loss, which meant that if I won, if the other players tied with each other, I would be first. If they did not, I would tie with first place with whoever won the other game. But would they be able to win the game? Let's see. But before we go to the game, let me first share the screen with the announcement of the tournament. And here we are. As you see from the announcement, the tournament took place on Sunday, December 7th. The location was Jericho, New York. It says this is a part of Long Island. And there were various sections. There were 5 sections. The under 2000, that is where I participated, under 1200, under 800, under 400, and the development, the under the section. Some photos from the location. Here to the top right, you'll see the playing hall. Here's another view from the playing hall. And thanks to the organizers that had made sure that boards, sets, clocks, pieces all had been set correctly before the game started, so the players did not need to worry about this detail. This is the rest area where players during breaks between rounds and also other spectators could relax and play some basketball or some other games. And these are the trophies, unfortunately only for the lowest sections. My opponent. Before my opponent, the time control. The time control is for my section. First of all, there are 3 rounds, meaning every player had to face 3 opponents, 3 rounds. Time control G45, D5, meaning 45 minutes. When the game started, players had 45 minutes on their clock, but when it was the time to move, for the first 5 seconds, the clock would not move, and then it would go downwards, and players needed to complete all their moves before clock went down to 0, otherwise they were timed out. My opponent now requested not to be identified, so I'm not going to mention my opponent's name and will only identify this individual as my opponent during the game. Just to tell you that my opponent's rating was slightly lower than mine, making me the slight favorite. But we're going to go to the chessboard of chess.com, the analysis board. And the way it works is as follows. I'm going to copy from the score sheet the moves one by one. On the board, you're going to see the position after every move. And the computer, because there is a stock v16 computer, is going to analyze and will tell us who is doing better. Positive number means white is doing better. Negative means that black is doing better. Computer will tell us which move would have been the best and what are the 5 options for the player whose turn is to come. And my opponent starts with the most popular move, pawn to e4. The king's pawn opening, you see here. And they reply with my standard French defense. It's not the most popular. Most popular is the Sicilian, pawn to c5. Also the symmetric is the next one, pawn to e5. But I know the French a little bit better, so I decided to stick with that. Knight to f3 for my opponent. This is a small surprise because usually white will send the pawn to d4 on the second move. But I've seen it quite a few times. It's not really a surprise for me. Pawn to d5. Then we exchange pawns on d5. And my opponent, and this is what's called the French defense knight variation. My opponent will place pawn on d4. Now it's called the French defense exchange variation. And I place my knight on f6. Next move, my opponent places pawn to c4. And all these are book moves, as you see here, meaning they have been discussed and analyzed in the theory extensively. part of chess opening theory. And I want to protect my pawn at d5, so I send my pawn to c6. Computer thinks it's inaccuracy, so we complete the first 5 moves with my opponent with white having an advantage of 0.32. Continue. My opponent places his knight on c3 to have better control of d5 square, and I decide to pin the knight on f3 and sending my bishop to g4. When you play Blitz on the internet, occasionally the opponent may forget the pin and move the knight and you win the queen and the game is over. But not in these classical terms. In fact, the computer thinks my move was an inaccuracy and would rather have my bishop go to b4. We change on d5, which means that both of us have an isolated pawn on the d5. Opponent sends bishop to f4. Inaccuracy. The computer sends mine on d6, and we exchange bishops. For me, it was the best move. And my opponent checks with the queen on e2. What they don't want is to lose castling rights. I can either lose them immediately if I place my king to any other square, or indirectly if I place my queen on e7 and we exchange queens. Instead, I place my bishop on e6. Now my opponent is going to check from b5 with the queen. And as you see, my pawn on b7 is in danger attack. There is a double threat, the king on e8 and the pawn on b7. But there are more than one way to stop them. I can place my queen either on d7 or on c6. Or even though the computer prefers another move, knight to c6. And does not believe that queen taking b7 is good, maybe because the rook on b8 will attack the queen will have to go away and then takes the pawn on b2. But I want to avoid these complications. My queen goes to c6. My opponent places mistakes as a computer. That I have the knight go to c6. I remember some time ago, I placed my queen on d7, my opponent had the bishop on c6, and my queen was pinned and I lost immediately. Not this time, but still a mistake. Knight goes to e5, attacks my queen. And what can my queen do? It has to take my opponent's queen. My opponent develops a bishop with a check. And for me, a chance to develop my knight from b8 and send it to d7. I still want to keep my castling rights. My opponent exchanges on d7. And check now, my opponent is checking at d7. And now, if I want to keep my castling rights and I take with the bishop, I lose a pawn on d5. And since there are no queens, castling right is not that important. We're reaching the end game, and that is why here I'm taking the king. At this point, we completed the first 15 moves. The difference is small. My opponent with white is leading by 0.20. And let's see what's going to happen. My opponent finally castles, uses his castling rights that he has kept. And the open file, the C file that I want to control, my rook goes to C8. My opponent challenges the control, rook to C1, and I want to double my rooks on the C file, and I put my rook on C6. My opponent places a knight on A4, and I'm afraid I don't want my opponent to place a knight on C5 and exert pressure on the bishop and who knows what. That's why I try to prevent it with pawn going to B6. My opponent decides to exchange the rooks on C6 and is going to check from C1. At least I have blocked the knight. It cannot come to me because both B6 and C5 squares are controlled by my pawns. My king goes to d6. Computer would rather have it to go to b5. I didn't want my king to be too exposed. On d6 it is out the pawn protected. We've continued the first 20 moves. Computer thinks if my king went to b5, I'd be ahead. But now my opponent is ahead by 0.30 after the first 20 moves. Knight goes to c3. Bishop goes to d7 for the next move. And we have an ending. Each side has a rook, which is also my opponent's knight versus my bishop. Pawns on both sides of the board. That's why I felt that bishop is doing better than the knight. I was looking forward to an ending with my bishop versus the knight, where pawns would be at both ends and my bishop could easily float from one side to the other. Pawn to f3 for my opponent. Starts pushing pawns. My rook goes to e8. Control the other open file along the other e file that's completely open. If the knight moves, I'm going to e2 and threaten the pawns. My opponent wants to stop it. Sends king to f2. In time for me to start attacking along the queen side. Pawn to b5. Pawn to e3 for my opponent. My pawn goes to a6. Knight goes to b1 for my opponent. And now, thinking that I was doing better because I had a nice bishop myself versus a knight that was at the edge of the board, I sent my rook to c8. My opponent exchanges. Miss, says the computer. Before the exchange, we completed the first 25 moves, and once again, with this miss, instead of being ahead as I would have been if my pawn went to b4, I end up being behind. White is ahead by 0.69. Rooks are exchanged. Knight goes to d2. Now my opponent starts developing the knight. And I want to start pushing the pawn. Pawn goes to f5. My pawn places bishop to b4. Now what is happening, and unfortunately the computer doesn't like it, but I'm going to explain the logic what's happening, even though they may not be the best computer generated moves necessarily. Yes, my bishop is a long-range piece, but only if it finds an open board. If my pawns get stuck on light-colored squares, then then my bishop is not so long-term, and the knight has advantage. You see here that at this point, 5 out of my 6 pawns are on light-colored squares. A6, let me show them: A6, B5, D5, F5, and H7. My opponent, by pushing the pawn to b4, basically is telling me that my pawn is stuck at a6. If it moves, it's taken. That is why, even though the computer may not like this position and may think better king to e3 to centralize king, personally I think it was a good move. My pawn goes to g5 now, continue pushing my pawns. I want, if pawns are exchanged, my pawns to be as far away as possible. Pawn to f4 for my opponent. And I want to continue pushing my pawn to g4. King goes to g3. My king goes to e6 at this point. We finished the first 30 moves, and at this point you see that all of my 6 pawns are on light-colored squares like my bishop. My bishop on c8, light color, and my pawns are on a6, b5, d5, f5, g4, h7. I started little by little realizing that things are not turning nice for me, even though the computer gives only a small advantage of 0.58. There is no tactics for my opponent yet, but my opponent can freely move the knight anywhere they like, while myself, I have to use my king and my bishop to defend my pawns. Let's see how the game continues. My opponent sends king to h4. My king goes to f6. I started being worried now. You see, my bishop basically cannot go anywhere after the 6th rank, can only go 6th, 7th, and 8th ranks. That's not the kind of bishop I'd like to have. King goes to h5. And now I'm worried about my pawn at h7. King goes to d7. With time being, I protect every pawn, but for how long is the question? Knight goes to f1. My opponent wants to start using the knight and placing it in the appropriate squares where I can attack my pawns, and for how long can my king and bishop defend them. So basically my opponent has the initiative, I have the defense. It's already a game where it's almost impossible for me to win. The best I can hope for is a draw. My bishop goes to e6 to protect both d5 and f5 pawns. Knight goes to e3. And here, what can I do? The king is approaching. I want to send the king back, and I check from f7, which the computer thinks a mistake. Until now, the game was more or less even. My opponent had an advantage most of the time between 0 and 1, but now my opponent's advance becomes huge, 5.68. Would rather have my pawn go to h6, because then I would block the g5 square, which does not happen, so the king goes to g5. Great move, says the computer. My opponent's advance becomes 6.00. I want to send my king back. Pawn goes to h6, the best I could play. Excellent, but king goes now to that. I didn't notice, but there was no way I could save the f5 square. If instead I push my bishop to e6, the knight would still take and would exchange pieces. So once I went here, my opponent uses the king to take at e5. But before we move to the next move, we completed the first 35 moves, and my opponent has a 6.09 advantage. Now it is huge. Not only he has a better position with my bishop being blocked by my light colored pawns, but also has an extra pawn. Now gains the extra pawn. What can I do? Pawn goes to h5. Let's see how far I can push my pawns. Pawn goes to g3 if my opponent blocks my pawn. Bishop to g8. At least let's protect the pawn on d5. King go to e5. Now the d5 pawn is lost. My king goes to d6. Let's see if my king can do something else. Knight goes to f5, hoping for a fork. If I do nothing, the knight goes to h7, check, and even if we exchange bishops, then my pawn is lost and I'm out of luck completely. Bishop to f7, so at least I avoid the fork. Knight goes to e7 with the check and the fork. King to d7. Completed the first 40 moves you see here, and my situation becomes worse and worse. 7.59 advantage for my opponent. Grabs the pawn at d5. Now I'm 2 pawns down. King goes to g6. Can my bishop stop the king bishop stop the avalanche? My opponent already has 2 advanced pawns. d4 and f4. Almost impossible for me to stop them, but let's see what will happen. I never lose hope. Knight to e7 again, check. King to g7. If d4, the pawn goes to d5. Approach promotion. How can I stop it? If I take it here, I lose my bishop. Then it's hopeless. Bishop to e8. Let's see if I can stop it at before it goes to d7. Not so easy. King to e6. My king goes to f8 to threaten the knight. Pawn goes to d6. And then checking from f7. Can this stop? At best can delay. My situation becomes even worse. I knew I was losing. I didn't know by how much. 9.15 for my opponent. King goes to d7. Another check. Could I be lucky and have a threefold repetition? Nope. King goes to c7. At least now, if pawn moves, at least takes a knight. The king goes to f7. None of my pawns can move. That is another problem I'm facing. So I have to move bishop and king only. Otherwise, I'm losing a pawn. As if it's not enough that my pawn has two protected pawns, we're going to have a third one. Pawn goes to d7. What can I do? If I take the knight, pawn goes to d8 and promotes with a check. Which is the smallest evil? Yes, it is what the computer suggests. Otherwise, it is bishop takes on d7. King takes the bishop. Where can my king go? You see now the wonderful M appears in the evaluation instead of a number M22, meaning if my opponent plays perfectly in 22 moves at most, I am mated. Let's place my king to f6. King to d6. Any chance? Because look what's happening, at least theoretically, even if my opponent has an extra pawn and an extra knight, if I can promote one of my pawns, I win the game. Not very likely, but at least in theory, this possibility exists. My king unfortunately cannot go forward. I wish we go forward and perhaps exchange on h4, take the h2 pawn and threaten with the g4 pawn, but my king cannot go forward. If I keep it there, I have to move a pawn. I wish I didn't have to play as a Sejong. What can I do? King goes back to f7, so at least I don't lose material. We completed the first 50 moves, and the m22 has already become m12. In 12 moves, if my opponent plays correctly, it is over, but you never know. You may remember from a previous video, I was 2 rooks down and my opponent stalemated. My opponent plays his knight to d5. And I know what's going to happen. It's going to go c5 and win my opponent a6. King goes to g6. Can I do anything else on the king side? Even there, I'm down 3-2. And my king cannot even start doing all these wonderful journeys because the f4 pawn is passed and will promote. But if at least I can exchange here and my pawn has two isolated passed pawns, I might be able to take one after the other if my opponent places all the kings on the queen side. My opponent places the king on e6, have a position. My king, where can it go? I'm going to go to h6. Pawn to f5 for my opponent. My king goes to g5. Pawn to f6. I try desperately to see what can I do. I go to h4. If my opponent would exchange, I might have one out of a million chances to do something here. But my opponent doesn't even allow me this hope. Pawn to h7. We change on g3. But we completed 55 moves. It is m4 at this point. Believe it or not, my opponent can checkmate me in 4 moves. Ideally, my opponent would keep the enormous advantage by promoting the pawn, but instead decides to deprive him of any hope and win the pawn on g3. Otherwise, I would be 1 square away from promotion, and who knows. Here we are. Now, any hope for a stalemate? What if I lose my pawns? If I go to a pawn and then goes to a4, maybe my opponent promotes to a queen. and my pawn goes to a4. Now I cannot move any of my pawns, which means if my opponent is careless and without checking me the price my king of a square, it is a stalemate. Will this happen? Let's give a look. My opponent sends queen to f5, check to make sure no stalemates. My king goes to h6. Now, theoretically, if my opponent would move the king to f6 or f7, it is a stalemate. But will this happen? Unfortunately, I was praying, I was hoping, I was dreaming, but my opponent takes my pawn on g4, and now it is mating two moves. My king will have to go back to h7, my opponent's king goes to f7, and then no matter where I put my king, h6 or h8, it is mate next move. So at this point, I resigned. And congratulations to my opponent, got second point, and this way I ended up tying with I'm not two or three people, I think with two people for second place. The winner of the other game got first place, and I tied with the loser of the other game and with my opponent of this game with 2 points. Unfortunately, I lost a few rating points, not that many, but I lost a few rating points. But let's now do the analysis of the game. But just to tell everyone, losing is part of chess. And here, okay, I lost fair square, but many times you may be well ahead and make one mistake at the end and lose. My big mistake clearly was since we ended up with bishop versus knight, not placing my pawns on dark colored squares. I made the result of my game is that my bishop could not go all over the board. It was too much constraint. And the tactical mistake you saw here was just a symptom and not the cause of my loss. But let's give a look at the review. .7 accuracy for my opponent, 83.2 for me. My opponent played as if the rating was 2450, almost a grandmaster, and mine was 2300. I can't believe that. My game was very poor, especially near the second half after we ended up with knight versus bishop, because when we first exchanged the rooks, I still had some hope. No brilliant moves, one great moves each of us. Best 23 for my opponent, 17 for me. Excellent 14 for me, 20 for my opponent. Good 11 for my opponent, 6 for me. Book for 5 for my opponent, 4 for me. Inaccuracies, 3 for my opponent, 5 for me. Mistakes, 1 for my opponent, 3 for me, and 1 missed each of us. This concludes the coverage of the chessanity tournament. The next chessanity, this was the 85th chessanity tournament, by the way. The 86 is going to take place in February, in 2 months. In the meantime, I'm continuing with the December Swiss of the Queen's Chess Club. In a couple of days, I'm playing in round number 2. But let's go back to the online tournaments I'm following. We have the grecochess that I'm organizing, and we are near the final round. Round 1, Maxim Govoroka from Ukraine is waiting to see if Handing Achievements is going to start playing. Handing Achievements has 37 hours time to log in and play a move. Otherwise, Maxim Govoruka advances in the finals, where the opponents, the other finalists are Barak Seven from Israel, myself, Tehari from Greece, and my skin from Italy. Let's go to the other tournament where my Italian subscriber is organizing. And where the first round is near the end. The Underwater Moonlight, the 9 Moons tournament. You see here that 52 games remain, and let's see how things are going. Group 1, Lotus Time Chess from Japan and Oli Kimbo from Australia have advanced. Group 2, Spider 99 from Egypt has advanced. Group 3, Maxim Govorukha from Ukraine has advanced, so has Vian Carvanans from Malaysia. Third place is still a battle between Silvio 8888 from Croatia and Zanilor, my subscriber, the organizer of the tournament from Italy, RMV 9827 from Mexico, and Ray Duquel from the United States. Group 4, Arak Lion, it's advanced already. Group 5, all games have been completed. Sinan Fu from Greenland, AMMT from Indonesia, and Peran Perez from Palestine have already advanced. Group 6, again, games have been completed. Mathis B 2008 from France, David 8 times 8 times 8 times 8 from Brazil, and Munza 44 from Croatia have advanced. Group 7, here, although one game remains, we know who has advanced. Jenat F66 from Uzbekistan, Mebius from Nigeria, and Tragis from Brazil. Group 8, my group, where I'm out. Khaled Kadab from Egypt has advanced, and Elisa MSTL from Cuba. And myself, I'm stuck at position number 6. Then group 9, a lot of games remain to be decided. Joy Jake from South Korea is leading with 11 points, but nothing is sure. And this concludes today's coverage. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for watching. Thanks to all the viewers, to the subscribers, to the likes, and to the encouraging comments. I'm Harry Lasaniziris. This is my grecochess YouTube channel. For now, goodbye.